Shalom in the name of our Lord Jesus Christ. We are your favorite ex-Muslims spreading Christianity. It's me, Shino, and my wife, Shania Gabo. Of course, we have our guest today, Dr. Jonathan. Welcome all.
It's great to be here. Thanks.
Thank you. Welcome back, our lovely Somali Christian TV family. Please, if you are new to us, subscribe to our channel, and of course, subscribe to our brother, Dr. Jonathan. His channel is on the
Description bar.
Yeah, on the top, on the name. What do you call it? Yeah, you can see on there. So please subscribe to his channel and subscribe to our channel, and welcome back, all of you.
Yes.
God bless
yeah,
you.
as you see, we have
the title. I want to say title.
The title.
Sorry,
okay.
no one helped me.
Yeah.
Sorry about that. Yes.
Yes. Yeah. Today we are so blessed to have our brother Jonathan, and he is an amazing brother, an amazing teacher. We know him through our dear brother Sam Shamoon. So the topic we have today is scientific and historical reasons to consider Christianity. And I would love to give the platform to our brother Jonathan. And Jonathan, please just tell our audiences who you are firstly, briefly, and then go into the topic, please. God bless.
Sure. So my name is Jonathan McClatchy. I live in Boston, Massachusetts, where I am an assistant professor of biology at Sattler College, which is a local Christian liberal arts college in the heart of Boston. And I'm originally from the UK. I did my PhD in biology at Newcastle University in England. And I'm Scottish myself. And I'm interested in scientific arguments for the existence of God, for intelligent design, and that sort of thing. And I'm also interested in historiographical evidence for the veracity of Christianity in particular. And you can find my website for more information at jonathanmcclatchy.com, and I regularly post articles there, and you can also find links to my recent videos there as well. So if you want more information and how I also interact with a lot of critics of the arguments that I adduce on my website. So if you want to find out how I respond to various critiques of arguments that you hear, then you might want to go to my website, jonathanmcclatchy.com. So then let's just launch into the topic for today, which is scientific and historical reasons to consider the truth of Christianity. And we could perhaps start with the scientific reasons, which I think point very powerfully to the conclusion that indeed God exists. Yeah, the universe that we live in is the product of a creator, and not something that has arisen by purely naturalistic forces. So my own particular area of expertise is in the life sciences or biology, and I am interested in the molecular wonders of the cell and the information bearing processes of the cell, in particular the hereditary molecules of DNA and RNA. And before we can talk about the evidence for intelligent design, we have to first discuss what do we mean by intelligent design? What is the thesis that I am defending? So one definition of intelligent design that you'll often hear promulgated by the popular press and the media is that intelligent design is the idea that living systems are too complex and improbable to be explained by the process of evolution, and therefore they require the invocation of a supernatural being to explain their existence, such as God. And that's a very common definition that you'll hear promulgated by popular culture. But I would suggest that there's actually some real problems with that proposed definition, namely that it's a God of the gaps fallacy, right? It's an argument not based on what we do know about the cause and effect structure of the world, but rather it's an argument based on ignorance. It's an argument based on what we don't know about the cause and effect structure of the world. And so I would propose a better definition of intelligent design, which is to say that intelligent design is the idea that we can infer from patterns in nature that some features of living systems are best explained by an intelligent cause rather than a stochastic process involving chance and physical necessity. So there you can see right away I have framed the argument such that it's no longer a negative argument where God or a designer is being used as a placeholder for that of which we are ignorant, but rather it's a positive argument. It's an argument based not on what we don't know about cause and effect, but what we do know, namely that there are certain features of living systems and the world more broadly, which bear the hallmarks of an intelligent cause, rather than an unguided, mindless process of chance and physical necessity. So how then would I build the argument for design? Well, what do we mean first of all by evidence? When we say that the particular piece of data is evidence for a hypothesis, what do we actually mean by that? Well, I would define evidence as follows: that evidence is that which makes a hypothesis more probable than it would have been otherwise in the absence of that particular piece of evidence. Or put another way, evidence is that which is more probable given a hypothesis than given the falsity of the hypothesis. So to give an illustration, to give an illustration, imagine that we have a courtroom, and the forensic scientist steps forward and he presents the murder weapon of the accused, and the murder weapon contains the fingerprints of the accused on the handle. And that doesn't prove that the defendant is guilty, but it is evidence for that conclusion because the presence of the accused's fingerprints on the murder weapon is more probable given that the defendant is guilty than given that he's not guilty. And so therefore it is evidence for the guilt hypothesis. It raises the probability that the defendant is in fact guilty. So that is what we mean by evidence. So what sort of features of the world are we trying to explain when we when we're looking at living systems in particular? So we know that life is chock full of digitally encoded information content, and this is contained in the molecule that we know as DNA, which stands for deoxyribonucleic acid. And DNA bears the property of specified complexity. That is, so specified complexity is a quality where two criteria have to be met in order to qualify as being specified complexity. The first criterion is that the probability of a phenomenon being produced by chance alone exhausts the available probabilistic resources. And I'll explain what I mean by that in just a moment. And secondly, the phenomenon conforms to some independently specified pattern. So what do I mean by probabilistic resources? So let's consider something that we're all familiar with, which is ATM machines, right? We've all used ATM machines where you put your bank card into the ATM machine and you dial in a 4-digit PIN number and you extract money from your bank account having dialed in that 4-digit number. Now, on a standard PIN pad, there's 10 digits of 0 to 9.
Yeah.
And so how many ways are there of dialing in a 4-digit number? So there's 10,000 possibilities, right? There's 10,000 ways that you could dial in a 4-digit number. That's 10 raised to the 4th power possible ways of dialing in a 4-digit number. However, only one of those 10,000 possibilities is specific to your bank card.
Yeah.
Right. So that is what we mean by specified complexity. Now, let's suppose that after 3 attempts, say 3 failed attempts at guessing the right PIN number, the bank locks you out of your account, right? Yeah. As a security measure. Well, that's what we call probabilistic resources. That's the number of opportunities you have to get the right PIN number by guessing, right? Mm-hmm. So likewise, for something to qualify as being complex, by the definition that I'm here using, the probability of a phenomenon being produced by chance alone has to exhaust available probabilistic resources, the number of trials you have to get it right. So to take an example from everyday life, consider Mount Rushmore, where we have in South Dakota a rock formation that actually has the faces of 4 U.S. presidents chiseled into the rock. Yeah. Now, that is not particularly more complex a conformation than any other random cliff face. Mm-hmm. It's highly improbable and not particularly more improbable than any other random rock formation. However, what sets Mount Rushmore apart is that it's not only complex, but it has specificity. It has conformity to an independently given pattern. Likewise, if we were to consider the Rosetta Stone, we see that we have hieroglyphic inscription on the Rosetta Stone, and that is not only highly complex, but it's also specified, and that it conveys meaning. It has a semiotic dimension, if you will. Or if you were to imagine any string of characters like "Time and tide wait for no man," or "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God." These are strings of characters that convey functional specificity, that convey meaning. We have this higher level objective being achieved by the working together of those different components that are together achieving that higher level objective, and that is something that is uniformly associated with design or with conscious activity. And so when we look at the cell and we find that it's chock full of digitally encoded information content, and we know that in every realm of experience, information content, especially in a digital form, whether we're looking at a computer programming script or a hieroglyphic inscription or pages, paragraphs and pages in a book, we know that sort of effect is uniformly associated with conscious activity. And so when we find that sort of feature of the cell, the most reasonable explanation, I would argue, is that it too arose by virtue of an intelligent cause rather than an unguided natural process of chance and physical necessity. Because that sort of feature is more probable given the hypothesis of design than given the falsehood of the design hypothesis. Another way you can formulate the argument is as an inductive inference based upon the principle of uniformitarianism. So Charles Lyell was a famous 19th century geologist who wrote a landmark classic in the history of science known as Principles of Geology. And the subtitle was being an attempt to explain changes in the Earth's surface with reference to causes now in operation. And Charles Lyell basically argued that if you want to explain effects in the remote past, you need to let your present experience of cause and effect guide your search for the best explanation. So, for instance, if you want to explain the existence of volcanic ash on an island, then you would favor the volcanic eruption hypothesis, not the flood hypothesis or the earthquake hypothesis, because in every realm of experience, volcanic ash comes from volcanic eruptions, not from floods, not from earthquakes. And so likewise, when we look at the cell, we know in every realm of experience of cause and effect, the information content comes from minds, not from unguided processes. Mm-hmm. So when we look at the DNA molecule, we see running along the spine of the DNA molecule, or to use the technical word, the sugar phosphate backbone of the DNA molecule, these chemical subunits that function as alphabetic characters in a written language or digital characters in a machine code. The information-bearing properties of DNA and RNA in terms of the chemical subunits that function that way were elucidated by Francis Crick in 1957, where he proposed that these chemicals known as bases function much like alphabetic characters in a written language or digital characters in a machine code. And when the DNA molecule, the code that runs along the DNA molecule is arranged in the protein coding regions of the DNA molecule is arranged in groups of 3, which are known as codons, which are basically akin to words that we have in human languages. So these are 3-letter words, and each of these 3-letter words, and there's 64 different combinations of 3 that are used, and each of those 3-letter words, they're known as codons, and they each specify an amino acid. And amino acids form the building blocks of proteins. And there's 20 different amino acids that are used in life, and that are used in biological proteins. And there are 64 different codons and 20 amino acids, which means that you have some amino acids are coded for by multiple codons, and this results in a genetic code redundancy, where there's actually sometimes you can mutate a codon and result in the same amino acid. And it actually turns out that the genetic code, that mapping system between codons and amino acids that they specify, is finely tuned. It's highly optimized for minimization of errors. to protect the cell from the detrimental effects of substitution mutations. In fact, the system is so brilliantly set up that codons differing by only a single base either end up specifying the same amino acid or an amino acid that is a member of a related chemical group. So in other words, the structure of the genetic code is set up to mitigate the effects of errors that might be incorporated during translation. And there's various other features of the genetic code that are also fine-tuned towards minimizing the effects of different sorts of errors that you could come across. Mm-hmm. And the genetic code is something which seems to be very difficult to evolve by natural processes such as natural selection acting on variation, because if you modify the codon to amino acid mapping, if you modify the genetic code, then you're going to end up changing every protein that's produced by the cell, because you're going to end up changing every amino acid. If you're changing that codon to amino acid mapping over time, then you're going to be wreaking havoc, because you're having to change every polypeptide, every protein that's made by the cell. Now, let's suppose, though, that you could get a substantially evolving genetic code. Well, Hubert Yockey, who is a biophysicist and information theorist, has argued that the number of potential genetic codes is of the order of something like 1.4 times 10 raised to the 70th power. So that's like 70 zeros after the 1. Mm-hmm. So, and Yockey concedes the extremely lax figure of 6.3 times 10 to the 15 seconds for the time available for the genetic code to evolve. So that's the time, not going back to the beginning of life or even the beginning of the Earth, but going right back to the origins of the universe. 6.3 times 10 to the 15 seconds is the approximate amount of time that has elapsed since the beginning of the universe. So how many codes then per second would be required to be evaluated in order for natural selection to, by chance, stumble upon the universal genetic code found in nature, along with all its optimization and fine-tuning? Well, according to Yockey's calculation, you would need to sample about 10 to the 55 codes per second. So that's 1 with 55 zeros after it. So there's all kinds of problems with trying to explain the origins of the optimization of the genetic code by trial and error, by means of a process like natural selection. There's also issues when it comes to explaining the origins of the macromolecular machines inside the cell. So Charles Darwin, in 1859, published The Origins of Species, and one very famous quote from The Origin of Species was when he said, if it could be demonstrated that any complex organ existed which could not possibly have been formed by numerous successive slight modifications, my theory would absolutely break down. And in 1996, Michael Behe, who's a biochemist at Lehigh University in Pennsylvania, sought to take up Darwin's challenge. And he put forward a concept that he called irreducible complexity. And he defined it as follows. He says that by irreducible complex, I mean a single system composed of several well-matched interacting parts that contribute to the basic function, wherein the removal of any one of the parts causes the system to effectively cease functioning. And to help illustrate what he means by that, he gave the illustration of a mousetrap. And the mousetrap has various different components. It has a platform, it has a spring, it has a hammer, it has a hold-down bar, it has a catch, and it has staples that hold the bits together. Now, if any of those parts were missing, you wouldn't have a trap that worked half as well as it used to, or a quarter as well as it used to, but would in fact be broken. It wouldn't work at all. It wouldn't perform its function, which is to catch mice. And the trap might still not even work if the holding bar were too short or the spring too lightweight. So the parts have to be crafted carefully one to the other so that they are able to work together to perform this higher level objective, namely catching mice. Now, it turns out that there are many examples of that sort of process in the cell. I'm going to try and show an animation here. Give me a second. To show one of those processes. This is the process of DNA replication. Give me a second here.
Yeah, no problem. Yeah, Chloe said Somali Christian TV, you guys getting it? Those words are big for me too. I think we are learning today. We have Dr. Jonathan, so we're so blessed. We have a lot of Somali atheists. We have a lot of atheists who come to this channel. So we need the explanation from our brother. So yeah, enjoy. And he will try his best to make basic, easy for all of us to understand.
Yes.
God bless you, brother. Yeah, carry on.
Indeed. So, so this is an animation of DNA replication, which is one of the machines that this is known as the DNA replisome, and it basically facilitates the replication of DNA in order to prepare for cell division. So, and you can see all the different parts and components that are working together.
DNA replication is carried out by a molecular machine called the replisome that pulls apart the double helix and makes an exact copy of each strand. In this visualization, we're going to examine the mechanism for copying DNA. The enzyme DNA polymerase synthesizes DNA molecules using the original molecule as a template for the production of a complementary strand. The genetic code in the template strand is paired to free-floating bases, matching cytosine to guanine and adenine to thymine. DNA polymerase creates an exact copy of your DNA code, making less than one mistake in a billion bases.
Wow.
I think he's muted.
Yeah, you are muted, brother.
Yeah, I apologize. Yep, you can see just how exquisite the design engineering of these processes in the cell is. Wow. And the replisome, and as well as many other machines that we find in biology, is composed of various components, and each of those is contributing to this higher level objective of replicating DNA. The components aren't useful in themselves, but taken together, they accomplish this higher level objective of replicating the DNA. And if any of those components was missing, you wouldn't have a DNA replication machinery that works half as well as it used to, or quarter as well as it used to, but would be broken. So for example, the DNA polymerase, which is the component that replicates the DNA, if you didn't have that component, then there would be no replication at all. If you lost the sliding clamp, which loads, which holds the DNA polymerase onto the DNA, then the DNA polymerase would frequently fall off the DNA template, and it would be too inefficient for replication. If you didn't have, there's an enzyme called DNA helicase, which unwinds or unzips the DNA molecule to prepare for copying. If you didn't have that, then the DNA polymerase would stall because it wouldn't be able to separate the strands of the template DNA ahead of it. And so little or no DNA would be synthesized. There are single-stranded binding proteins that stop the DNA from reannealing during the replication process. If you didn't have that, then the DNA strands would reanneal before they could be copied. And there's plenty other components that we could talk about, each of which is essential for that system to even work. And so that sort of feature is something which is not at all surprising given the hypothesis of design, but it seems to me to be quite surprising given the falsehood of the design hypothesis. So there are other evidence. There's other categories of evidence in biology which likewise I think point to design as the best explanation. So for example, there's the origins of protein structures, which are the components which are proteins are basically the molecular components that comprise the molecular machines inside the cell, and also contribute to biochemical pathways where you're generating a particular product by this sequence of enzymatic reactions. And these are accomplished by molecules known as proteins, which are, as I mentioned earlier, are encoded in the DNA molecule. And as I said earlier, there are 20 different amino acids that are used in cellular proteins. So let's suppose that we have a sequence of amino acids that's 150 amino acids long.
There's one question. Brother,
Yeah, we've got a question from Dragon. It says, Shania and Shino, please ask Dr. Jonathan, what's the name of that amino acid whose structure is like a cross? Do you know anything about that?
So so there's a structure called laminin, which is an adhesive molecule, and holds some cells together. So there's an argument that some people who are so Louis Giglio was the person who popularized this argument. I think it's a very poor argument because there's not a very strong likelihood ratio where it would be more where it would be a very surprising thing given the falsehood of theism. So I find that to be a weak argument, and I personally wouldn't recommend using it. Mm-hmm. So for example, if we were to look at the cell and find that there's a molecule that has the shape of a crescent, would that have any bearing on the truth of Islam? Well, we wouldn't find that very impressive argument. And so I think we need to subject Christian arguments to the same level of scrutiny that we'd subject Islamic arguments to or atheist arguments to. So I wouldn't recommend utilizing that particular argument. Okay. So as far as proteins go, so I mentioned earlier that there are 20 different amino acids that are used in cellular proteins. And that means that for, let's take a modestly length protein of 150 amino acids. And there are, so how many possible ways are there of arranging those amino acids? How many combinations are possible of those 150 amino acids? Well, there's 20 different kinds of amino acids, and we have a sequence of 150. So that's going to be 20 possibilities at each site, right? Yeah. So that will be 20 raised to the power of 150 possible combinations. So that's 20 times 20 times 20 times 20, all the way up to 150. So that's a huge combinatorial space. That's a huge number of possibilities of arranging those particular amino acids. And a question that we can ask is, of all those possibilities, how many of those sequences correspond to a stable and functional protein structure, and how many of them are gibberish? Because we know in the English language, words convey meaning largely by virtue of the fact that meaningful sentences are rare, given the number of combinatorial possibilities. So there's far more ways of writing gibberish, there's far more ways of writing nonsense than there are ways of writing functional sentences that actually convey meaning. And it turns out that the same is true in life. So there's been research done, and there's various studies that have been done. The most famous of which is probably Doug Axe's work, who's a molecular biologist who did his postdoc work at University of Cambridge on this topic, and he subsequently worked at the Biologic Institute in Seattle, and he's currently at Biola University. But he has published probably some of the most famous work on this topic, but there's others as well who have contributed to this problem. And the question that we can ask is, as I said, how rare are these stable and functional protein structures given that vast array of possible ways of arranging those amino acid sequences? And it turns out that the ratio is astronomically small. In other words, there's far more ways of arranging those amino acids to spell out gibberish than there are of producing these functional and stable protein structures. And so, according to Doug Axe's estimate, for example, there's 1 in 10 raised to the 74th power. Now, to put that in context, there's only 10 to the 65 atoms in the galaxy, right? There's only 10 to the 80 subatomic particles in the known universe. So we're talking about like searching for a tiny, tiny needle in an enormous haystack and having a very limited time to search. And then when we need molecular machines that require multiple very specifically crafted proteins in order to perform this higher level objective, the probabilities just multiply exponentially. So there's all kinds of really significant problems for explaining the origins of the complex molecular machinery that we find in life. I'll give another example of evidence for design, which is the problem of causal circularity. Now, causal circularity is probably more popularly known as the chicken and egg paradoxes, right? Which came first, the chicken or the egg? And when we look at the cell, we see that the DNA is what's called transcribed into an intermediary molecule known as messenger RNA, that happens inside the nucleus, and then it's taken outside the nucleus through the nuclear pore into the cytoplasm. And in the cytoplasm, there's a two-part chemical factory known as a ribosome, which is a site of protein synthesis, and it functions to translate that messenger RNA into proteins. And what's interesting is that each amino acid, and so each amino acid and nucleotide has its own biosynthetic pathway. So a biosynthetic pathway is where you have enzymes that are catalyzing each step, and so causing A to turn into B, and then B into C, and then C into D, and so forth, resulting in an amino acid or a nucleotide. So each of those amino acids and each of the nucleotides has its own dedicated biosynthetic pathway. But each step of a biochemical pathway is catalyzed by an enzyme, right? And enzymes are composed of amino acid subunits, which are coded for by the sequence of nucleotides in the DNA. So the subunits that make up the proteins, namely amino acids, are themselves produced by enzymes, and those amino acids are themselves coded for by nucleotides, which themselves require enzymes to synthesize. So this is a causal circularity problem of how you explain one without the other. Likewise, there's a related causal circularity problem, which is that DNA codes for proteins, but proteins are needed to replicate and transcribe the DNA. Which came first, the DNA or the proteins? And a solution that's sometimes given for this is known as the RNA world hypothesis, which is to say that at one time way back in the distant past, it wasn't that you had a chicken or an egg, but rather the chicken was the egg, so to speak. Namely, that is to say that the RNA is able to serve as an information storage medium, and is also able to form some of the functions that proteins could otherwise do in terms of catalysis. And there are our RNA is able to form these three-dimensional structures known as ribozymes that can perform some of the catalytic functions that are otherwise associated with proteins. So perhaps the first molecule before you had the DNA protein world was in fact RNA, and that's known as the RNA world scenario. But there's a number of really significant problems or challenges to the RNA world scenario. One is that RNA building blocks are hard to synthesize and very easy to destroy. Another one is that the ribozymes are poor substitutes for proteins. In fact, to date, scientists have shown that ribozymes can perform only a small handful of the thousands of functions that are performed by modern proteins. Another problem is that an RNA-based translation and coding system is implausible. An RNA-based replication system eventually would have to begin to produce proteins, and not just any proteins, but proteins that are capable of template-directed protein manufacture, or synthesizing proteins. But for that to occur, the RNA replicator first would need to produce machinery for building proteins. So as a first step towards building proteins, the primitive replicator would need to produce RNA molecules that are capable of performing the functions of the modern proteins involved in translation. And also the RNA world doesn't explain the origins of the genetic information, which is the crucial thing that all origins of life scenarios, all naturalistic origins of life scenarios, fail to explain the origins of the biological information content, which is the very property of those systems, which we habitually associate with conscious activity or designing intelligence. So even if a system of ribozymes for building proteins had arisen from an RNA replicator, that system of molecules would still need information-rich templates for building specific proteins. So the causal circularity problems also likewise present a very formidable obstacle to naturalistic origins of life scenarios. So there's just a flavor of the evidence of design in the life sciences. Does anyone have any questions at this point, or I could talk a little bit about the physical sciences if anyone has questions.
Guys, if you have questions now, you can just write it down now, or maybe you can just carry on later on. I believe people will have some questions, but later, I don't know. I don't see any question now. Do you see any question?
Okay.
Yeah, not now.
Sure. Well, feel free to interrupt me if any questions come through. But,
Yes.
there's also evidence of design in the physical sciences. And by the way, we're only being able to get to the very tip of the iceberg today. There's a lot more depth on all these topics that one could discuss. So this is just an introduction or an entry-level introduction to this topic. But there's also tremendous evidence of design in the physical sciences as well.
Yeah.
And scientists have long recognized that the universe appears to be fine-tuned for the existence of life. And I'm not talking about fine-tuning for this form of life, or for Chuek Bur asked, is the animation available on YouTube? Yes, if you just key in DNA replication animation, then you'll find it. There's quite a few on that topic, so you'll find that and other animations as well. And if you want to email me, jonathan@jonathanmcclatchy.com, I can send you that particular animation as well if you like. Okay, so in terms of the fine-tuning of the laws and constants of the universe, we understand that the universe appears to be balanced on a razor's edge for life of any form to exist anywhere, anytime in our universe. And if the laws and constants and early conditions of our universe vary by so much as a hair's breadth, then life, not just as we know it, could not exist, but life at all could not exist in such a universe. So, for example, the ripples that are left over from the original Big Bang singularity, which is often referred to as the cosmic microwave background radiation, are detectable at 1 part in 10 raised to the 5th power. So that's 100,000. So if that factor were even slightly smaller, then the cosmos would exist exclusively as a collection of gas. So stars, planets, and galaxies would not exist. Whereas on the other hand, if that factor were increased slightly, then the universe would consist only of large black holes. And either way, the universe would be uninhabitable. Another finely tuned value is the strong nuclear force that holds atoms and therefore matter together. So the sun derives its fuel from fusing hydrogen atoms together. And when two hydrogen atoms fuse, 0.7% of the mass of the hydrogen atoms is converted into energy. So if the amount of matter converted was just slightly smaller, let's say 0.6% instead of 0.7%, then a proton would not be able to bond to a neutron, and the universe would consist only of hydrogen. Without the presence of the heavy elements, planets wouldn't form, and hence there would be no possibility of life. But on the other hand, if the amount of matter converted were increased, let's say to 0.8% instead of 0.7%, then fusion would occur so rapidly that there would be no remaining hydrogen. And so again, the result would be no planets, no solar systems, and hence no life. The ratio of electrons to protons has to be finely balanced to 1 part in 10 raised to the 37th power. So that's on the denominator 37 zeros after the 1. And if that fundamental constant were to be just larger or smaller than that, then electromagnetism would dominate gravity, which would prevent the formation of galaxies and stars and planets. And again, there would be no life possible. Another example is the ratio of the electromagnetic force to gravity, which has to be finely balanced to a degree of 1 part in 10 raised to the 40th power. So again, on the denominator, we have 40 zeros after the 1. And if that value were to be increased just a little bit, then all stars would be at least 40% more massive than our sun, which would mean that stellar burning would be too brief and too uneven to support any complex life. But if you were to decrease it slightly, then all stars would be at least 20% less massive than the sun. And that would render them incapable of producing the heavy elements. The cosmological constant, which determines how rapidly the universe expands, has to be fine-tuned to 1 part in 10 raised to the 120th power. And if it were a little bit different, then either matter would expand so rapidly that you would only ever get the 2 lightest elements of hydrogen and helium, or otherwise the the universe would collapse in on itself due to gravity, and you get a big crunch scenario. Either way, no life could exist in such a universe. So, in an article published in 2006 in Nature News, Jeff Brumfield, who's a physicist, confesses that if you believe the equations of the world's leading cosmologists, the probability that the universe would turn out this way, that is life permitting, by chance are infinitesimal. In fact, in 2012, an astrophysicist in Australia called Luke Barnes published a review of the scientific literature, which I think still is the most extensive review paper on this topic in the scientific literature. And he says that he can only think of a handful of physicists that oppose this conclusion and piles that support it. And he, in that paper, lists some of the widely recognized constants that require fine-tuning for life. So, for example, the cosmological constant, as I mentioned, is fine-tuned to 1 part in 10 to the 128th power. And if you get it wrong, as I said, the universe either expands so rapidly that you only ever get the 2 lightest elements, or it collapses within picoseconds of the Big Bang. And so no life would be able to arise in such a universe. One of the most intriguing conditions that has to be finely tuned in the early universe is the initial low entropy conditions of our universe. And Roger Penrose, who is a mathematical physicist at Oxford University, he argues, and he's not a Christian, as far as I know, he's an agnostic. And it turns out that nearly all arrangements of particles in the early universe would have resulted in a lifeless universe of black holes. Tiny inconsistencies in the particle arrangements would be acted on by gravity to grow in size, which results in this negative feedback, since the clumps of particles have an even greater gravitational force than nearby particles. And so according to Penrose's analysis, in the incredibly dense early universe, most arrangements of particles would have resulted basically in nothing but black holes. And of course, life wouldn't be able to exist in such a universe. And according to Penrose, the initial low entropy conditions of our universe is finely tuned to 1 part in 10 raised to the 10 raised to the 123rd power. So if you were to try and write that number down, there would be so many zeros after the 1 on the denominator that you'd run out of subatomic particles in the known universe before you run out of zeros after the 1. So that's the level of fine tuning that we're dealing with. Now, how can we attempt to explain the fine tuning of our universe? Well, there's 3 and only 3 broad categories of explanation which could purport to explain the origins of the fine-tuning of our universe. And those could act individually or in combination with one another. And those are the chance hypothesis, the physical necessity hypothesis, and the design hypothesis. Now, the physical necessity hypothesis is probably the weakest of the 3, because if we suppose that, and this is a very common objection that you hear from atheists, well, how do you know that there's not some sort of constraint that means that the laws of physics just have to be the way they are out of some sort of physical necessity? But the problem with that rejoinder is that it just shifts the problem of fine-tuning back a level, because then you still have to explain why the underlying principle that constrains the laws of physics constrains them such that they are conducive to permitting life to arise in the universe. So you just shift the problem of fine-tuning back a level if you suppose that there's some sort of physical necessity that somehow constrains the constants and the laws and conditions of physics. So I think that explanation doesn't get you around the fine-tuning problem. So the 2 that remain then are the chance hypothesis and the design hypothesis. And sometimes people will put forward the so-called anthropic principle, which is to say that of course we have to exist in a fine-tuned universe because we couldn't possibly exist in any other universe that wasn't fine-tuned for our existence. So the fact that we find ourselves in a fine-tuned universe shouldn't be surprising, and therefore there's nothing to explain. The problem with that rejoinder to the fine-tuning argument is, and this was an illustration put forward by a philosopher called John Leslie, is that he gives this analogy of imagine that you're taken before a firing squad and you're about to be executed, and you're blindfolded, and the marksmen all load their rifles, and you hear all the rifles go off, and then to your surprise, you're still alive. And actually, when the blindfold is taken off, all the bullets missed your body, right? And you might be very surprised to find yourself still alive, and wonder what the explanation is for the marksmen all missing. But you wouldn't say, well, I guess if I was dead, I wouldn't be here to contemplate the fact that I'm still alive, so there's nothing really to explain. Of course, that doesn't get you around the problem of having to explain why all of the marksmen missed. And likewise, with the fine-tuning, the fact that we hear doesn't absolve one of the need to explain the fine-tuning. So there's the more sophisticated way of putting forward the sort of anthropic principle is to combine it with the multiverse hypothesis, which is to say that we exist not in the only universe, but in but one universe of this ensemble of parallel universes, each with their own varying constants and parameters and conditions. And we couldn't be in any of these other universes that are not conducive to life. So it's not surprising then that we find ourselves in the one universe that can allow for life. And there's also significant problems with that scenario. One is that you don't just need any old multiverse to explain away the fine-tuning, but very specific kinds of universes. A very specific kind of multiverse. Namely, you need a lot of parallel universes, sufficient universes to explain away the fine-tuning. You also need the constants to vary across the universes, because if you have all the constants across those parallel universes all being the same, that doesn't, you're not exploring all of probabilistic space, and therefore you're not absolving the problem, the need to explain the fine-tuning. Another criteria of this multiverse is that it needs to be based on the same physics in order to have relevance or probabilistic relevance to explaining the physics of our universe. And it seems even that you probably need some level of fine-tuning in order to get to produce a universe-generating mechanism, which is going to have varying constants across each universe and also be based on the same physics. So it just results in another fine-tuning problem. Another issue is somewhat philosophically abstract. It's known as the Boltzmann brain problem, which is basically the multiverse hypothesis only really it works when you combine it with the anthropic principle, which is to say that there's an observer selection effect, namely that we just happen to be in the one universe that can support us because we couldn't be in any other universe, so it's not surprising that we're in this universe. The Boltzmann brain problem, which was put forward by an Austrian physicist called Boltzmann, is that it becomes far more probable that you would get a small patch of order where a single observer or single brain, if you will, fluctuates into existence out of the quantum vacuum, than that you would get a universe that is finely tuned for complex life forms such as we find ourselves in. It becomes probable that would exist in that sort of universe where there's just a single observer, than that you would get the multiverse. You would get the universe that is finely tuned for complex life forms such as ourselves. And so that's the sort of observer that you would be more likely to have, rather than the sorts of observers that we find in our universe. So there's just a few problems with the multiverse scenario, and there's others as well. If anyone wants to read up on the evidence for God, I recommend this book that just came out by my good friend Dr. Stephen Meyer at the Discovery Institute. It's called The Return of the God Hypothesis, 3 Scientific Discoveries that Reveal the Mind Behind the Universe. So I highly recommend that book if you want to read more on this subject. But you can see that the case for theism, the case for the existence of God, is multidisciplinary. We don't just have a single line of evidence that points to theism, but we have multiple lines of evidence, multiple categories of evidence that point convergently and consistently towards the design conclusion. And therefore, I think that each of these each of those lines of evidence that we've discussed, and this is just the peak of the iceberg, is rather more probable given the hypothesis of design than given the falsehood of the design hypothesis, and actually very significantly more probable given design than given the falsehood of design. And therefore, we have very compelling reason to affirm the theistic hypothesis that indeed God exists and that this universe is the product of a mind of a creator. So I'll pause here and see if there are any questions at this point.
Yeah, now is the time for questions, guys. If you have any questions, I think we want to speak, and some people just put on, but that's long ago. But I cannot see any questions. But guys, I think many people are asking. I think this class is too high level for many of us, because so many people are asking, do you understand? Some people they don't get it, but yeah, the questions will come later on. And
Okay.
Brother Bliss, also point of view of the atheists, the questions people asking is mostly they will say, if there's God, show me, where is he, so or not. So there's so many questions. I don't know how to answer for them, but I think maybe you'll take that later on. But yeah, do you have a question? Do you see any question, Somali Prophet? No questions now? I think people are just listening and observing.
Sure.
I don't know.
Sure. As to the objection that you raised about if God exists and show me, well, of course, God is an unobservable entity, but there are plenty of disciplines that where we invoke unobservable entities, such as in particle physics and various other places, in science.
Yeah, sorry.
Yeah, so we have another question here from Appy Frenzy. Appy Frenzy says, is DNA replication what happens when a new life is formed?
Yeah, so DNA replication prepares the cell for cell division. It's because you need to replicate, you need to reliably pass on your DNA. And actually, there's very elegant proofreading functions. So the DNA polymerase is not just a copier, but it's also a proofreader. Much like Microsoft Word, which detects if you made a spelling mistake, the DNA polymerase also detects when there's a spelling mistake that's been made and is able to correct it. So it's so the DNA polymerase actually in the more the versions of DNA polymers that have the highest fidelity are only making mistakes like 1 every 10 to the 7th to 10 to the 9th nucleotide pairs. They're very, very reliable, and it's used for replicating cells, and it's used for preparing the cells for cell division.
Yeah.
Wonderful. Yeah. So we got a question from Dragon. Dragon says, Dr. Jonathan, you said not to use that argument. Please say what's the purpose of laminin in our body. So when we were talking about like the laminin molecule that's in the shape of the cross before.
Yeah, it's an adhesive protein that tethers cells together. Yeah. I wouldn't use it as an argument because so when we're talking about evidence, we want to know what is the probability of the evidence given the hypothesis is true, and what's the probability of that same evidence given the hypothesis is false. And to the extent that that ratio is top heavy, that's the degree to which you have evidence for your hypothesis from that particular observation. And it doesn't seem particularly. It doesn't seem that you have a particularly top heavy likelihood ratio there, so I wouldn't use that as an evidence. I think that it's very weak to the point of being negligible if it has any evidential force at all. So I wouldn't recommend using it.
All right, wonderful. We've got another question from Proud Black Conservative. Proud Black Conservative says, simple question, why are so many scientists atheists?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that there is probably a complexity of reasons for that. I think that, and it's going to vary from individual to individual. There's not a simple one-size-fits-all explanation as to why someone has or doesn't have a particular belief. I think that there is a certain social pressure to. There's a social pressure for scientists to conform with a naturalistic worldview. It's kind of a vogue thing, and I think that the social pressure perhaps contributes to people being atheists, or perhaps atheism attracts people into the natural sciences. So there could be all kinds of reasons for that. But I certainly don't think it's a one-size-fits-all. And it surprises me, to be honest, because I was often baffled as an undergraduate, how anyone could go through a 4-year university program in the natural sciences and come out atheist at the other end, because the evidence for theism seems to me to be so compelling and spans so many different disciplines and so many different categories of evidence that it seems to me to make the design inference almost beyond question.
Wow. Yeah.
Okay. So if you like, we could talk about the historical evidence for Christianity in particular at this point, if there are no other questions.
Please. Yes, please. Sure. I don't see another question at the moment. Yeah.
Okay, so let me give the structure of the argument that I would adduce for the truth of Christianity from historical evidence, and then I'll fill in the details. So I would argue that that when we're talking about explaining the rise of Christianity and explaining the origins of the belief in the resurrection, I would argue that we have testimony concerning the resurrection of Jesus that is close up to the facts, well-informed, and habitually reliable. I would argue that we actually have evidence of what the original apostles claimed concerning the body of Jesus and what happened to the body of Jesus following his death, namely that Jesus rose from the dead. And I would argue, moreover, that the nature of the claims, the content of the claims of Jesus concerning Jesus' resurrection is enormously improbable, given that the apostles were honestly mistaken that Jesus rose from the dead. And I would argue that the circumstances of their testimony to have witnessed the resurrected Christ makes it quite improbable that they were deceiving others deliberately that Jesus had been raised from the dead. And therefore, the best explanation is that Jesus, in fact, did rise from the dead. So when we're trying to explain any testimonial claim, there's 3 and only 3 broad categories of explanation, and that this goes for any testimonial claim, whether we're talking about a sexual assault claim or any other sort of claim about criminal activity, or whether we're talking about Bigfoot sightings or alien abductions or the resurrection of Jesus. You know, any of these, all of these propositions have been put forward in testimonial claims, and we want to know what is the best explanation for those claims. And there are 3 and only 3 broad categories of explanation that could purport to explain them. One is that the claim is actually correct. So in this case, the claim would be Jesus rose from the dead. The second is that the claimant is deliberately lying for some reason or other. The third is that the claimant is honestly mistaken. And so these are the 3 and only 3 broad categories. Now, so can we establish then that the apostles did in fact claim Jesus rose from the dead? Because if we can establish they claimed that Jesus rose from the dead, then those 3 broad categories of explanation pertain. We have to determine which of those best explains the relevant data. Well, I would argue that we can. For example, if we go over to 1 Corinthians chapter 15, I'll bring it up on the screen so that people can follow along.
Yes.
Okay, so share a screen here. Okay, so this is Logos Bible software here. So I'm going to bring up 1 Corinthians 15. This is a very famous text. So Paul says, verse 3, "For I delivered to you as of first importance what I also received, that Christ died for our sins in accordance with the Scriptures, that he was buried, and he was raised on the 3rd day in accordance with the Scriptures, and he appeared to Cephas, then to the 12, then he appeared to more than 500 brothers at one time, most of whom are still alive, though some have fallen asleep. Then he appeared to James and to all the apostles. Last of all, as to one untimely born, he appeared also to me." So most scholars believe that this is actually not something that Paul has come up with himself, but is actually he's passing on an oral creedal tradition that he likely received from the Jerusalem apostles. Mm-hmm. Notice the language that he opens it with: "I delivered and received," which is language associated with passing on tradition. So I delivered to you as of first importance what I also received. And then you've got this very rhythmic structure that's designed for ease of memorization. Christ died for his sins according to the scriptures, that he was buried, that he was raised on the third day in accordance with the scriptures, that he appeared to Cephas, then to the 12. He appeared to more than 500 brothers at one time, most of them are still alive, though some have fallen asleep. Now, if Paul received this from the Jerusalem apostles, as most scholars seem to think, then that would indicate that the apostles indeed claimed that Jesus was raised from the dead. And people have put forward potential times when he may have received this. For example, people like Michael Licona or Gabriel Habermas will argue that he perhaps received this creed upon his visit to Jerusalem, recounted in Galatians 1, 3 years after his conversion, where he meets with Peter and James, the very people mentioned in that creed. And that's at least plausible. I don't think that it's a watertight case, but that's at least plausible occasion where he received that creed. But where I think that you can make a more robust argument is what pertains to what Paul says next. So look at verse 8. So in 8, he says, last of all, as to one untimely born, he appeared also to me. And then verse 9 to 11, for I am the least of the apostles, unworthy to be called an apostle, because I persecuted the church of God. But by the grace of God, I am what I am, and his grace toward me was not in vain. On the contrary, I worked harder than any of them, though it was not I, but the grace of God that is with me. Whether then it was I or they, so we preached, and so ye believed. So Paul, notice verse 11, whether then it was I or they being the other apostles, in particular Peter and James and the 12, so we preached, and so ye believed. Now, you'll notice that the Corinthians were acquainted with Peter's preaching. We know this because in 1 Corinthians 1, Paul chides the Corinthians for having divisions and factions in their midst. So he says, I appeal to you, brothers, by the name of the... oops, let me plug in my computer here.
No problem.
So he says, I appeal to you, brothers, by the name of our Lord Jesus Christ, that all of you agree, and that there be no divisions among you, but that you be united in the same mind and the same judgment. For it has been reported to me by close people that there is quarreling among you, my brothers. What I mean is that each of you says, I follow Peter, or I follow Apollos, or I follow Cephas, or I follow Christ. Is Christ divided? Was Paul crucified for you? Or were you baptized in the name of Paul? And so forth. So he chides the Corinthians for having divisions and factions among them. Some say I follow Cephas, others I follow Apollos, others I follow Paul, others I follow Christ. So the Corinthians were evidently acquainted with the preaching of Peter. And so Paul seems to imply here in 1 Corinthians 15, verse 11, whether then it was I or they, so we preached, so you believe. In other words, they'd already heard this proclamation from the other apostles, including Peter, who's specifically mentioned in 1 Corinthians 15. So this provides some evidence that the resurrection claim indeed goes back to the other apostles. Mm-hmm. So there's other evidence, though, that also substantiates this. So, for example, we can take the book of Acts. So Luke is an individual. He was a medical doctor, a physician, and he undertook to write a narrative concerning the life and times of Jesus of Nazareth. And he says in his prologue to his gospel that inasmuch as many have undertaken to compile a narrative of the things that have been accomplished among us, just as those who from the beginning were eyewitnesses and ministers of the word have delivered them to us, it seemed good to me also, having followed all things closely for some time past, to write an orderly account for you, most excellent Theophilus, that you may have certainty concerning the things that you have been taught. So he claims that he's received information from eyewitnesses and ministers of the word, and is not entirely clear whether he, just from that text alone, whether he's interviewed eyewitnesses himself or whether he's just receiving oral tradition that he believes has come from eyewitnesses. Nonetheless, if we go over to Acts 21, we see that actually Luke is someone who is in a position to interact with people who were indeed eyewitnesses. So in Acts 21, we read about Paul's visit to James, who was the leader of the church in Jerusalem. It says, when we had come to Jerusalem, the brothers received us gladly. On the following day, Paul went in with us to James, and all the elders were present. After greeting them, he related one by one the things that God had done among the Gentiles through his ministry, and so forth. So notice that Paul is in Jerusalem. And notice that this is among the so-called we passages in Acts. So from Acts 16 and following, Luke starts to use the plural pronoun we, which is interpreted by most scholars at face value to mean that Luke is actually claiming to be a traveling companion with the Apostle Paul and actually claiming to be present during those scenes. And notice that he meets with James, the Jerusalem leaders, and all the elders. And actually, Luke was present with Paul when Paul was imprisoned at Caesarea Maritima for 2 years subsequent to this, and which is actually quite close to Jerusalem. So he would have ample opportunity to interact with that treasure trove of living witnesses to Jesus' resurrection in Jerusalem, including James, the Jerusalem leader, and the elders of Jerusalem. Now, is Luke correct when he tells us that he was present with Paul during the scene, or did he make it up? Well, we can actually establish that Luke is a traveling companion of Paul, and there's lots of evidence for this that we won't have time to do justice to today, but let me give you a few examples. So in Acts 16, for example, you have the introduction of the we passages, and in Acts 16, they actually trail off when Paul goes through Philippi, when Paul goes through Philippi, the we passages trail off subsequent to that. In Acts 16. And then they start again in Acts 20 in verse so they start again in Acts 20. So verse 7, the first day of the week when we were gathered together and so forth. So those went on ahead and were waiting for us at Troas. So they're in verse 5. So they start again when Paul goes back through Philippi, which suggests that the author of Luke Acts had remained behind in Philippi and then subsequently rejoined Paul upon Paul's travels once again through Philippi. So it's very consistent with that, and the casualness of that and the undesignedness, if you will, points to Luke indeed being a traveling companion of the Apostle Paul. There's also other lines of evidence that support Luke being someone who was closely associated with Paul. So, for instance, if you look at 1 Corinthians 4, this is an example of what's known as an undesigned coincidence, which we'll talk about. So undesigned coincidences were first documented by Christian philosopher William Paley, and they are basically when you have multiple accounts, often two accounts that narrate an event that dovetail with one another in accidental and undesigned ways that tend to point to the truth of the account. So you'll notice here in 1 Corinthians 4, verse 17, it says, "That is why I sent you Timothy, my beloved and faithful child in the Lord, to remind you of my ways in Christ." Now, just some background here. So Paul is writing 1 Corinthians from Ephesus in Asia Minor. And we know this because Paul towards the end of the letter, he sends greetings from Aquila and Priscilla, whom he had met in Corinth, and they traveled with him as far as Ephesus. And so scholars have determined that Paul is writing 1 Corinthians in Ephesus, and he was writing around probably 53 AD. We know that because in Acts, we learn that Gallio is proconsul of Achaia at the time, and we know from extra biblical sources that Gallio was proconsul of Achaia between 51 and 52 AD. So that's the setting and context of 1 Corinthians. So in verse 17, it says, "That's why I sent you Timothy." So notice the past tense. So at the time of Paul's writing of 1 Corinthians, he's already sent Timothy on his way from Ephesus to Corinth. Now, if we go over to chapter 16, and we see another very incidental remark, which says, verse 10, "When Timothy comes, see that you put him at ease among you, for he is doing the work of the Lord as I am." So here we have the future tense, when Timothy comes. So what can we discern from those little clues in 1 Corinthians? Well, we'd infer that that Timothy must have taken some indirect overland route going. Ephesus is in Asia Minor, what we now know as Turkey, and it's across the Aegean Sea from Achaia, which is where Corinth is, now known as Greece. And the most natural way to send a letter would be by boat from Ephesus to Corinth. It would be the most direct way of sending a letter. And we'd infer from those clues in 1 Corinthians that Timothy, in order for him to have already sent Timothy, but nonetheless expect his letter to arrive expect his letter to arrive before Timothy arrives. The most natural way to explain that is Paul sends his letter by boat from Ephesus to Corinth, and Timothy takes the indirect overland route, going up through Troas and Macedonia on his way around from Ephesus to Corinth. And when we go over to the book of Acts, chapter 19, we see that's exactly what happens. So this is when they're in Ephesus, and it says, after these events, Paul resolved in the spirit to pass through Macedonia and Achaia and go to Jerusalem, saying, after I had been there, I must also see Rome. And having sent into Macedonia 2 of his helpers, Timothy and Erastus, he himself stayed in Asia for a while. So he stays behind in Ephesus, and he sends Timothy and Erastus up through Macedonia, presumably on their way around to Corinth, though it doesn't specifically mention that in Acts. And notice also that Timothy is going there with a traveling companion, namely Erastus, who is not mentioned as traveling with Timothy in 1 Corinthians. But we know from the book of Romans, chapter 16, that it says that Erastus, the city treasurer, greets you, and we know that Romans was written in Corinth. That Erastus was actually a city treasurer in Corinth, and we actually have archaeological evidence that indicates there's a pavement slab in Corinth which actually has an inscription on it that says Erastus, the city treasurer, paid for this pavement at his own expense. And so we actually have we have archaeological evidence for an otherwise very minor character in the New Testament. So Erastus' hometown was Corinth. He's traveling with Timothy up through Macedonia. So it fits very well with those clues that we find in 1 Corinthians 4 and 1 Corinthians 16. And thus it tends to point to the truth of Acts, and also the authenticity of 1 Corinthians in that case. There's plenty of other examples one could talk about. For example, in Acts 15, we read about Paul's second missionary journey, and remember that Paul and Barnabas separate because Barnabas had withdrawn from Paul and Barnabas in Pamphylia, and so it causes this sharp disagreement such that they split company. And it raises an interesting question in the mind of the audience: why is Barnabas so keen for Mark to travel with them, even though he's abandoned them in Pamphylia on a mission trip? Well, if we go over to Colossians chapter 4, we learn, so it says in verse 10, very incidentally, Aristarchus, my fellow prisoner, greets you, and Mark, the cousin of Barnabas. Right? So we learn that there was a familial relationship between Mark and Barnabas, which then illuminates in Acts Barnabas's keenness to take Mark with them on the journey. And so that then corroborates the Pauline authorship of Colossians, and it also supports the historicity of Acts. And there's plenty of examples of that sort of pattern. I mean, if you give me just Romans, 1 Corinthians, 2 Corinthians, and Galatians, just the first four letters in the New Testament, I could already give you more than 40 examples of that sort of undesigned coincidence between Acts and the letters of Paul. We also have plenty of so that suggests that Luke is someone who's in the know in regards to Paul's ministry and travels, someone that's presumably he's traveled with Paul, or for times where he perhaps was not present, has interacted with Paul and received information that is informed and reliable. Now, we also have, in addition to these undesigned coincidences, and that's just scraping the peak of the iceberg, we have extra biblical corroborations that also help to support that Luke is an eyewitness to many of the events that he talks about. So an example of this is if we go over to Acts 23, it says, and there's, by the way, there's over 100 examples of extra biblical corroborations in Acts alone. If you want to get resources on that, I recommend Colin Heemer's book, The Book of Acts in the Setting of Hellenistic History. Also Craig Keener's 4-volume set on Acts, really great resource. James Smith, The Voyage and Shipwreck of St. Paul, is just a few great resources on that subject. So in Acts 23, it says, this is when he's been apprehended and brought before the Jewish council, and Ananias is presiding over the Jewish council. Looking intently at the council, Paul said, "Brothers, I have lived my life before God in all good conscience up to this day." And the high priest Ananias commanded those who stood by him to strike him on the mouth. Then Paul said to him, "God is going to strike you, you whitewashed wall. Are you sitting to judge me according to the law, and yet contrary to the law, you ordered me to be struck?" Those who stood by said, would you revile God's high priest? And Paul said, I did not know, brothers, that he was a high priest, for it is written, you shall not speak evil of a ruler of your people. Now, this raises an interesting question. How come Paul doesn't know who the high priest is, right? Surely he could tell by his garb, if nothing else. And if you read commentaries, you sometimes come across these really far-fetched explanations, like perhaps he was going blind and he couldn't see properly or something like that. But there's actually a very simple explanation. If you read Josephus, who is a first-century Jewish historian, we can surmise from reading Josephus that Ananias, of whom this was spoken, was in truth not the high priest, but he was sitting in judgment in that assumed capacity. So he'd previously held the office, he'd been deposed, the guy who replaced him, called Jonathan, had been murdered, another had not yet been appointed to the station. So during the vacancy of his own authority, he assumed upon himself the discharge of the office. So then that illuminates Paul's words. Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't realize he was the high priest, right? It's a jab at Ananias. You also see another example in Acts 24, where Paul is before the Roman tribune, and basically, I think it's in Acts 24. Anyway, he's before the Roman tribune, and Paul says that he's not. They can't flog him because he's a Roman citizen, and the tribune says, "I paid a great price for my citizenship," and it turns out, if you read Cassius Dio, that Claudius introduced the you could purchase a Roman citizenship, and it started off really expensive, but then so it was extortionately priced. But then over time, even during the reign of Claudius, the price came progressively down, and so people who bought their citizenship early were a little bit upset at people that had bought it more recently because they got it much cheaper. And so then that illuminates the words of the tribune. I paid a great price for my citizenship. In other words, how much did you pay, right? So another example of a very incidental extra-biblical corroboration. One other example I'll mention is in Acts 19, where the city clerk during the riot in Ephesus tells the crowd that there are proconsuls in the plural. And a proconsul was a Roman authority to whom one might take a complaint. And normally there would be only a single proconsul. There it is there. The courts are open and there are proconsuls. Normally there would only be one proconsul, but just at that particular time, because this is from Tacitus, according to just at that particular time, as a result of the assassination of the previous proconsul Silanus by poisoning in the fall of AD 54 by the two imperial stewards at the urging of Nero's mother, there was actually in fact two proconsuls at this particular time. So then that's something that's otherwise very surprising in the text. There are proconsuls in the plural, yet we know that there was actually at this particular time two proconsuls. So again, confirming Luke being in the know and someone who is well informed and habitually reliable. So that's just the peak of the iceberg. There's much more that one could share in regards to Luke's being present with Paul. There's great cumulative case that can be made for Luke being present with Paul in Acts 27 during the shipwreck. There's a lot of very incidental details that we can corroborate and confirm there. Colin Hemer touches on that. There's a whole book on it by James Smith called The Voyage and Shipwreck of St. Paul, if you want the details. I've also written on it on my website. So we can establish then with confidence that Luke was indeed someone who very likely was a traveling companion of Paul, and therefore he was at the Jerusalem church in Acts 21, and therefore he was present with Paul in Caesarea Maritima, that he had access to that treasure trove of living witnesses to the bodily resurrection of Jesus, and so he's in a position to be in the know as to what the Jerusalem apostles were claiming concerning the resurrection encounters with Jesus. And Luke, of course, represents the Jerusalem apostles as claiming Jesus rose from the dead. In Acts 2, we have Peter proclaiming at Pentecost that this Jesus, God is raised from the dead, and of this we all are witnesses. In Acts chapter 1, we learn that the resurrection encounters with Jesus were extended across a 40-day time period. In Luke 24, we read about the long discourse where Jesus talks to the disciples on the road to Emmaus. We learn and so forth, and he has the group appearance to the disciples in Luke 24 as well. So And I would also argue that in addition to Luke's testimony, we have evidence from the Apostle John, who was also a witness, I would argue, to not just people who themselves were witnesses to Christ's resurrection, but John was actually a witness himself to the resurrection of Jesus. So I can give a few examples from John to show that he himself is someone who's in the know and very, very likely himself an eyewitness. Let me share my screen here again. So here we go over to John's Gospel, and this is John chapter 6. You can see on the left-hand side here. So in John chapter 6, we have the feeding of the 5,000. Oops, I'm not sharing screen here. Can you see my screen? I think you can.
Not yet.
Okay, let me fix that.
The internet problem.
Let's try this. Okay, it says it's sharing, but it's otherwise I can just do it verbally.
Shall I add? If I click, I don't know.
There you go. Okay.
Yeah, I clicked.
Okay, great. So in John 6, we have the setup for the feeding of the 5,000 miracle. And in verse 5, it says concerning Jesus, lifting up his eyes then, and seeing that a large crowd was coming towards him, Jesus said to Philip, where are we to buy bread so that this people may eat? Now, this raises an interesting question in the mind of the audience. Philip's a fairly minor character in the Gospels. Why does Jesus turn to Philip here in particular? Why not, say, Judas Iscariot, who's in charge of the money bag, or someone like that? Well, why Philip? Well, so hold that thought for a moment. Now, let's go over to the Gospel. Let's go over 6 chapters later. It's a completely unrelated part of John's Gospel, John chapter 12. Where we read that this is concerning a different Passover feast, that there were those who went up to worship at the feast were some Greeks. So these came to Philip, who is from Bethsaida in Galilee, and asked him, Sir, we wish to see Jesus. So we learn just very incidentally here in this parenthesis that Philip was from Bethsaida in Galilee, right?
Yeah.
Now, where was the feeding of the 5,000 taking place? Well, let's go over to Luke chapter 9. This is the parallel account of the feeding of the 5,000 according to Luke. By the way, the feeding of the 5,000 is the only miracle except the resurrection that's found in all 4 Gospels. So in Luke chapter 9, we see, and he called the 12 together. Actually, let's skip that bit. Verse 10, rather. On their return, the apostles told them all they had done, and he took them and withdrew apart to a town called Bethsaida. So the event takes place in Bethsaida. And so let's put the pieces together then. So Luke doesn't mention Philip in this context at all. He just mentions him speaking to the disciples. John doesn't mention Bethsaida as the setting of the miracle story. And it's only in John 12, it's also in John 1, that we learn that Philip is from the town of Bethsaida in Galilee. So when you put the pieces together, now we have a cogent explanation for why Jesus speaks to Philip in John 6:5. He's a local guy. He knows where the shops are to buy bread because the event's taking place in Bethsaida. But notice that that's never explicitly spelled out for you in the text. You have to do the difficult detective work of putting the pieces together and gathering those clues from John 6, John 12, and Luke 9. And then when we put those pieces together, now we have an understanding of why Jesus speaks to Philip in John 6:5. And that sort of pattern, it's called an undesigned coincidence, is more probable given the hypothesis of historicity than given the falsehood that this is non-historical. Another example of this relating to the feeding of the 5,000. So there's also a narration of the feeding of the 5,000 in Mark's Gospel in chapter 9. I'm sorry, I misspoke. In Mark chapter 6. So Mark chapter 6. So the apostles returned to Jesus and told him all they had done and taught. And he said to them, "Come away by yourselves to a desolate place and rest a while, for many were coming and going, and they had no leisure even to eat." So here we get a sense of the hustle and bustle of the region. That it's so busy. There's people coming and going. They can't find anywhere to. They can't find anywhere. They can't find leisure to eat because it's just so busy. So hold that thought, and then we continue reading, and we learn that Jesus commands the people, verse 39, he commanded them to all sit down in groups on the green grass, right? Now, about that green grass, the grass in Palestine throughout most of the year is brown, not green, except at a very narrow window of time because of the higher levels of rainfall around the spring or near the time of Passover. Now, let's go back over to John's account in John chapter 6. Look at verse 4. Now, the Passover, the feast of the Jews, was at hand. Now, John doesn't mention the people coming and going and the fact that they had to go to the desolate place because they couldn't find leisure to eat. John doesn't give us that detail. And John also doesn't mention the green grass, but he does give us the explanation for those features of Mark, namely the Passover feast was near. Whereas Mark, who tells us that there were about how busy it was and the grass was green, he doesn't mention that the Passover feast was near. And so by putting the pieces together, now we have a complete picture. And that sort of pattern, it suggests independence, and it points to the historicity of the account. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So another example, if you go over to John chapter 12, this is another event that's reported in all four Gospels is the triumphal entry. And John tells us that the night before the triumphal entry, Jesus arrived in Bethany. And he arrives in Bethany 6 days before Passover. Now, John is the only gospel that tells us that Jesus arrived in Bethany 6 days before Passover. Now, he also tells us that in verse 12, the next day, you've got the triumphal entry. So he's the only gospel that tells us that Jesus' triumphal entry happened 5 days before Passover, right? 6 days before Passover, he enters Bethany. The following day, he enters Jerusalem on the back of a donkey. So 5 days before Passover, he enters Jerusalem. Now, if we go over to Mark's account in chapter 11, we learn, so they drew near to Jerusalem, to Bethphage and Bethany at the Mount of Olives, and Jesus sent two of his disciples. So Mark actually telescopes or collapses the narrative. He doesn't mention that it was actually the night before Jesus arrived in Bethany. It wasn't until the morning he sent the disciples to get the colt. He just summarizes it a little bit more briefly than John does. But you've got the disciples fetching the colt, and then in verse 12, in verse 11, it says he entered Jerusalem and went into the temple. And when he looked around at everything, as it was already late, he went out to Bethany with the 12. Now, let's assume, for the sake of argument, that John is actually correct, that Jesus' entrance into Jerusalem occurs 5 days before Passover. So this then, according to John's chronology, would be the evening 5 days before Passover. Now, bear in mind, Mark has not given us a timestamp like John has. So this would, if John is correct, this has to be 5 days, the evening 5 days before Passover. Now, let's continue down to verse 12. On the following day, when they came from Bethany, he was hungry. This would be the morning 4 days before Passover, if John is correct. And he curses the fig tree.
Yeah.
And then verse 19 says, when evening came, they went out of the city. Right? So this would be the evening 4 days before Passover, if John is correct. Now, verse 20, as they passed by in the morning, they saw the fig tree withered away to its roots. This would be the morning 3 days before Passover, if John is correct. Now, when you get to chapter 13, you have the Olivet Discourse, where Jesus has a conversation with his disciples on the Mount of Olives. And the Mount of Olives is midway between Jerusalem, where Jesus has been all day, and Bethany, where Jesus' accommodation is for the night. So we can assume, I think, reasonably, that Jesus is on his way home back to his accommodation in Bethany for the evening after being finished with his ministry in Jerusalem. So this is the evening then, 3 days before Passover. Now let's go over to Mark chapter 14. Verse 1, it was now 2 days before the Passover. So you see that it synchronizes exactly as you would expect, given the chronology of John. But you see how undesigned and incidental and casual that dovetailing between Mark and John is. Mark telescoped the account in Mark chapter 11. He didn't mention that Jesus actually arrived in Bethany the night before. It wasn't until the morning he sent the disciples to fetch the colt. Mark chapter 13 doesn't specifically say it was the evening, but you infer it from the fact, the geography of where the Mount of Olives is in relation to Jerusalem and Bethany. And so it fits in a very casual and accidental way that doesn't suggest that John is just simply copying Mark or using him as a source on that particular point. But it points to the veracity of the account and actually suggests that John is someone who is close up to the facts and well-informed, because that's a very specific detail to get right? It's very, very extraneous detail that's specific to John. Likewise, the account of Philip concerning Philip in John 6, he remembers who the specific disciple was that Jesus spoke to at the feeding of the 5,000. John is someone who is close up to the facts, well-informed, and habitually reliable. And there's plenty of additional evidence that supports that conclusion also. And so when we look at John's resurrection accounts, we see that the resurrection accounts are actually, I'll give one more. This is actually an example pertaining to the resurrection account. So the discovery of the empty tomb. So one common objection that's raised by skeptics is that the synoptic gospels, which are Matthew, Mark, and Luke, contradict John in terms of how many women and which women went to the tomb on Easter morning. So in Luke 24, for example, it mentions that there were various other women that went to the tomb. It was Mary so verse 10, it was Mary Magdalene, Joanna, and Mary, the mother of James, and the other women with them who told these things to the apostles. Now, of course, Luke is explicit that he's not intending to give us an exhaustive list. And so there's no issue with him conflicting with the Matthew and Mark, who give a slightly different list of women who go to the tomb on Easter morning. However, what's interesting is that John seems to indicate, if you just take verse 1 at face value of John chapter 20, that it was just Mary Magdalene that came to the tomb. It says, on the first day of the week, Mary Magdalene came to the tomb early while it was still dark and saw the stone had been taken away from the tomb. Well, what about the other women? And you'll see this example in Bart Ehrman's book, Jesus Interrupted, for instance, as an example of a contradiction between the Gospels. Now, what's interesting is that if you continue to read in verse 2, it says, so she ran and went to Simon Peter and the other disciple, the one whom Jesus loved, and said to them, they have taken the Lord out of the tomb, and we do not know. The Greek is ukudamen, right? We do not know. It's a plural pronoun. We do not know where they have laid him. And so the use of the plural pronoun there actually presupposes that there were, in fact, other women with her. And actually it dovetails in a very casual and incidental way with what we find in the Synoptic Gospels and points to independence and also truth. And so we can see that the Gospel of John appears to be written by an individual who is well-informed, he's close up to the facts, and he's habitually reliable. And when we look through his account concerning the resurrection, we see that the resurrection encounter with Jesus is polymodal, it's multisensory, involves Jesus inviting Thomas to touch him. It involves physical contact with Jesus, group conversation with Jesus, eating breakfast with Jesus on the shore of the Sea of Galilee, and so forth. And that is the sort of thing that's very difficult to be honestly wrong about, right? And likewise, I would argue that, although I haven't had time to show it, that the other Gospels, also Matthew and Mark, are likewise based on substantially trustworthy eyewitness testimony. They're written by individuals who are close up to the facts and well-informed and habitually reliable. And therefore, we have to take seriously what they say concerning the nature of the resurrection encounters as coming from the risen Jesus. We have to take seriously the nature of the resurrection encounters that they report is coming from the original apostles who made those claims. And so the fact that the resurrection encounters are polymodal and multisensory, that according to Acts chapter 1 is extended across a 40-day time period, so it's not just a brief, confusing episode, that's something that's very difficult to be honestly wrong about. Now, if you talk to a skeptic, you'll often hear that, well, eyewitness testimony is notoriously unreliable in the court of law, so you're in precarious ground to use eyewitness testimony. And that is true under certain conditions. And studies have shown, and if people want those studies, I'm happy to send them to you. Studies have shown that eyewitness testimony is typically unreliable when certain conditions are met, namely when the participants are strangers to one another, when there's a weapon present, such as a knife or a gun, or when the events happen very quickly over a period of seconds or minutes. But we see with the resurrection encounters that the resurrection encounters involve multiple sensory modes, not just sight, but group sightings, physical contact with Jesus, eating breakfast with Jesus, group conversations, group dialogue, and so forth, and being extended across a 40-day time period. So it's very difficult to see how the apostles could be honestly wrong about that. And then So that significantly reduces the plausibility of the honest mistaken hypothesis, which leaves us with two remaining contenders, namely that that Jesus really did in fact rise from the dead, or the disciples deliberately made it up and they lied about it. Just one other quick line of evidence against the honest mistaken hypothesis. If we go over to 1 Corinthians 15, we see Paul actually calls Christ the first fruits from among the dead, meaning that he is raised, he's the first to be raised to glory and immortality ahead of the general resurrection at the end of the world. And we that of course is referring to or alluding to the first fruits feast, which was which we read of in Leviticus 23, which was instituted to praise God for the first fruits of the harvest, which was the guarantor, if you will, that the general harvest would likewise come. And that was to be celebrated, according to Leviticus 23, on the first day, on the day following the first Sabbath following Passover, which would be the Sunday. So Christ's resurrection then happens on the day of first fruits. And that is something that seems to point away from the honest mistaken hypothesis and towards the design hypothesis. That seems to be the product of conscious intent because of the theological symbolism involved in Christ's resurrection being on the first feast of first fruits, because Christ, just like the first fruit, he is the first to be raised to glory and immortality ahead of the general resurrection at the end of the world. He is the guarantor, if you will, of the rest of the harvest, the resurrection of the saints, which is to come later. So that points to design. And then we have to find out, okay, what is the locus of the design? Is it that the disciples made it up, or is it that God decided to raise Jesus from the dead himself on that particular day? Well, we can then turn our attention to evaluating that remaining competing hypothesis, namely that the disciples lied about it. And one line of evidence against that is that the apostles were willing to suffer and die as martyrs for their testimony of the risen Christ, which is something which is more probable given the hypothesis of sincerity than given that they were not sincere. Because liars make poor martyrs, right? When life or liberty are at stake, multi-party conspiracies invariably break down. Now, we have to be careful with this argument because we have to be careful not to overstate it, because for most of the apostles, we don't really know how they met their end. And the accounts concerning the martyrdom of most of the apostles are very late and subject to legendary embellishment. So, however, I think that we can make a robust case that Peter, Jesus' closest disciples, willing to die as a martyr. We have two first-century sources and also some second-century sources that attest to that. John 21, for example, where Jesus says that the day will come when you'll be stretched out, you'll be and so forth, where he's clearly speaking about the crucifixion of Peter. And John probably was writing after Peter's martyrdom, and so it seems unlikely that John would have included that prophecy and attributed it to Jesus had Peter not actually met that end. And also Clement of Rome, who's a first-century Christian, he was actually made bishop of the church in Rome by the apostles, writing to the Corinthian Christians in around AD 96 is the consensus date for First Clement. He also, in chapter 5, alludes to the martyrdom of Peter as well as Paul, the apostle. So we have good reason to think that Peter died as a martyr. We also have good reason to believe that James, the Lord's brother, died as a martyr. Josephus, in Antiquities of the Jews, who's not a Christian but a Jewish historian, mentions the martyrdom of James, the Lord's brother, in Book 20 of Antiquities of the Jews. Is also mentioned by a second-century Christian historian called Hegesippus in the fifth book of his memoirs, as quoted by Eusebius in Ecclesiastical History. It's also and I like to ask a skeptic, because James, it seems, was not a believer during Jesus' lifetime, right? And, John 7 verse 5 says, not even Jesus' own brothers believed in him. In Mark 3, Jesus' family come to take him home and they say he's out of his mind. And yet very shortly after the resurrection, you see that Jesus' family, Jesus' mother and brothers are praying alongside the disciples in Acts 1. Mm-hmm. James becomes the leader of the Jerusalem church. And I like to ask a skeptic, how much would it take to convince you that your elder brother was the Yahweh of the Old Testament to the point of martyrdom, right? Something pretty radical. Yeah. Imagine doing Bible studies with your elder brother and you're studying how God led the Israelites out of Egypt and poured out the 10 plagues on the Egyptians and appeared to Moses at Mount Sinai, and your elder brother's like, yep, that was me. I did all that. Well, that was stirring credulity. And yet that's exactly what Jesus claimed. And so James's willingness to die as a martyr is more probable given his sincerity than the falsehood of that. Also, James, the son of Zebedee, we have good reason to think died as a martyr. We have attestation to that in the book of Acts, which is a first century source. We have to be careful not to overstate that argument, but we can also say with confidence the thing that we can be most certain about, because another objection that sometimes comes up is, in regards to this argument, is that we don't know that the apostles were specifically dying for their belief in the resurrection. Yes, the resurrection was integral to their Christian beliefs, but it could have been simply that they caused civil disturbance and that they were killed for that reason and that they weren't given a chance to repent. And so it's a little bit more complicated than many people make out. And my response to that is that one thing that we can say for sure, and also, of course, Peter and Paul and perhaps others likely got caught up in the Neronian persecution in the 60s, where Nero basically blamed Christians for for causing the fire in Rome, that they angered the gods, and this caused the fire in Rome because Nero shifted the blame away from himself because people had blamed it on him, and fire that broke out in 64 AD. So Peter and Paul and others likely got caught up in that. But one thing that we can say for sure is that the apostles were willing to die and willing to suffer tremendous persecution for their beliefs, and that they voluntarily underwent sufferings and trials and difficulties and hardships in view of their newfound Christian faith. And that is something which is more likely, given the hypothesis that they were in fact sincere, than that they were not sincere. And another category of evidence that tends to point against the conspiracy hypothesis is that the Gospels consistently make women the primary discoverers of the empty tomb. In the context of first century Palestine, which was a patriarchal society, the testimony of a woman was not highly regarded. In fact, a woman was not allowed to testify in court, at least when there were male witnesses available, and so the testimony of a woman was not highly regarded. And so any legendary or fictional account would presumably have made male witnesses rather than female witnesses be the chief discoverers of the empty tomb. So Josephus, in his Antiquities of the Jews, he says, "Let not the testimony of women be admitted on account of the levity and boldness of their sex." The Jewish Talmud says, "Any evidence which a woman gives is not valid to offer." Now, there's also, in addition to the fact that, so to summarize that particular fact, that the discovery of the empty tomb by women, according to all four Gospels, and these seem to be independent accounts as well, is more likely, given that the authors are sincerely reporting what they believe really happened, that women really were the chief discoverers of the empty tomb, and that they faithfully reported what was for them an otherwise awkward and embarrassing fact. There seems to be also reason to believe that the accounts concerning the women's discovery of the tomb are independent of each other. I mentioned earlier in John 20 verse 1 and how it dovetails, John 20 verse 2 dovetails with the accounts in the Synoptics about the other women that were present with Mary Magdalene in discovering the tomb. Another reason to think that the accounts in the Gospels concerning the women's discovery of the empty tomb is independent is as follows: that if we go to Luke chapter 8, verse 1 to 3, it says, speaking about, it mentions the female disciples that followed Jesus from Galilee. It says, "Soon afterward, he went on through cities and villages, proclaiming and bringing the good news of the kingdom of God. And the 12 were with him, and also some women who had been healed of evil spirits and infirmities. Mary called Magdalene, from whom 7 demons had gone out, and Joanna, the wife of Chuza, Herod's household manager, and Susanna and many others who provided for them out of their means." Now, we can infer from the previous chapter, in chapter 7, from verse 1 and following, that Jesus and his disciples are in Galilee, because Capernaum is on the northern shore of the Sea of Galilee. And it's also supported that the women are from Galilee because Joanna was the wife of Herod's household manager. And Herod, of course, was the Tetrarch of Galilee. Now, in Mark 14, it says in verse 40 and 41 that there were also women looking on from a distance, among whom were Mary Magdalene and Mary, the mother of James the younger, and of Joseph and Salome. When he was in Galilee, they followed him and ministered to him. And there were also many other women who came up with him to Jerusalem. So those names in Mark 14 overlap only partly with Luke 8. So in Mark and Matthew, the names are Mary Magdalene, Mary, the mother of James and Joseph, and Salome. And there is no mention there of Joanna or Susanna. And Luke 8 doesn't mention Mary, the mother of James, or Salome. So it doesn't at all look like Luke added the passage in chapter 8 in order to put the women in place earlier in Jesus' ministry and thus fit his narrative together with Matthew and Mark concerning the women at the cross, because the names are only partially the same. And Luke would have presumably included Mary, the mother of James and Salome, and probably left out Susanna if he had fictionalized the verses in chapter 8 on the basis of Mark's mention of the women at the cross. And Luke himself mentions the women who came from Galilee at the cross and burial in chapter 23, verse 49 and 55, but he doesn't even name any of them there. So both accounts, therefore, confirm apparently independently that there was a group of women who had begun following Jesus in Galilee and who continued to do so and who helped Jesus in concrete ways by ministering or providing. And now when you go over to Luke 24, the angels tell the women that he is not here, but this is verse 6 through 10, but is risen. Remember how he told you while he was still in Galilee that the Son of Man must be delivered into the hands of sinful men and be crucified and on the third day rise. And they, that is the women who'd come with Jesus from Galilee, remembered his words, and returning from the tomb, they told all these things to the 11 and to all the rest. And then it says in verse 10, that it was Mary Magdalene and Joanna and Mary, the mother of James, and the other women with them who told these things to the apostles. So that makes it clear that these women really were personally with Jesus in Galilee, and they heard what he said there. Now, when Luke names various women who brought the disciples news of the empty tomb and the message of the angel in Luke 24:10, he names Mary Magdalene, Mary, the mother of James, and Joanna, and says that there were other women as well. So once again, he doesn't seem to be trying to reproduce his own list from chapter 8, because Mary, the mother of James, was not on that list, and Susanna isn't mentioned in Luke 24:10. Nor is he reproducing Mark's list of women at the cross or Mark's list of women who came to the tomb in Mark 16:1, because Salome isn't included in Luke's list, and Joanna, who's unique to Luke, is not included in Mark's list. Luke seems to be listing women whom he really knows were in fact present for the events on Easter morning. Evidently, he isn't sure about Susanna's presence, or he just doesn't bother to mention her for whatever reason. And he knows that Mary, the mother of James, was there on Easter morning, even though she isn't listed in his chapter 8. So that's an example, again, of an undesigned coincidence that's internal to Luke, where we have fairly distant parts of Luke's own narrative that fit together in an apparently casual and non-deliberate way. And it tends to confirm that these women were indeed at the cross and the resurrection of Jesus at the empty tomb, and they were the chief discoverers of the empty tomb. So we have very powerful reason, I think, to believe that the apostles were not honestly mistaken in their claim that Jesus rose from the dead, and they also were not deliberately deceiving others into believing he rose from the dead. I'll perhaps give a couple other reasons why. Actually, maybe I'll stop and see if there are any questions at this point. Are there any questions?
Question time. Can you see
Sure.
any question? Yeah, but you can do, if you have some questions, you can put on there. And and later on we can also ask some more questions. Yes, and welcome everybody. We're so glad to have you here today. It is amazing day because we have our brother Dr. Jonathan, who's teaching us, and this topic is needed someone who knows so well, and we are so blessed to have our brother. So welcome everybody, and subscribe to our channel, and subscribe to our brothers and Dr. Jonathan's channel as well. Yeah, that's what.
Yeah, Brother Jonathan, it was so great to hear all these evidences and mention eyewitnesses and all the accounts of the resurrection of Jesus. What we see is after 600 years, Allah comes in and says this is never happened.
Allah
says that, and many people are believing that now, and they say Jesus never been, he never been crucified, never died, never rose to, to life, and so on. So how can we convince them again, as you all, you embedded all and highlight and all things, and we are convinced and we know that. But there are many who don't believe this eyewitness accounts, and they believe someone who came 600 years later and claiming this never happened.
Yeah, so Muslims, as you all know, believe that Jesus was not in fact crucified. That's contained in 40 Arabic words in Surah 4, verse 157. It also spills over into 158 of Surah An-Nisa, chapter 4 of the Quran. And the common classical interpretation that Muslims offer for how to explain the evidence is to say that Jesus, someone was made to look like Jesus or resemble Jesus. That's how they interpret the phrase "deluded by resemblance" in Surah 4, verse 157, and was put on the cross in Jesus' place. And Jesus, meanwhile, ascended into heaven. And there's problems with that contention. One is, and I call this the crucifixion dilemma, that Jesus, in fact, predicted ahead of time his impending death and subsequent resurrection from the dead. And so one of two things is true. Either Jesus was, in fact, killed by crucifixion, which would contradict the Quran, so Islam's false, or Jesus was not killed by crucifixion, which would be consistent with what the Quran says, but then he would be a false prophet because Jesus claimed in advance that he would be raised from the dead. And so in that case, Islam's also false because Islam claims that Jesus is a true prophet. So it's damned if you do, damned if you don't sort of problem. It's a catch-22. Now, the Muslim might come back and say to that, well, how do you know that Jesus really, in fact, historically predicted his impending death and resurrection from the dead? Is that not perhaps something that the gospel authors have invented? Well, there's a number of lines of evidence that suggest very strongly that Jesus, in fact, predicted his impending death. So I'll share my screen here to go back to the scriptures. So let me share screen. Let me give you one or two examples. So in John chapter 2, verses 18 and 19, this is just after Jesus has cleansed the temple towards the beginning of his public ministry. And it says, the Jews said to him, "What sign do you show us for doing these things?" Jesus answered them, "Destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up." And the Jews then said, "It's taken 46 years to build this temple, and will you raise it up in 3 days?" But he was speaking about the temple of his body. Whenever he was raised from the dead, his disciples remembered that he had said this, and they believed the scripture and the word that Jesus had spoken. So he speaks about his temple being the body, his body being the temple of God, because in the Old Testament, the temple was where you went to meet God, right? That was where God dwelled with his people. And likewise with Jesus, that's where we go to meet God. That's God's very presence dwells in Christ. As Colossians 2:9 says that the fullness of God, of deity, dwells in bodily form in the person of Christ. Now, is that an authentic saying of Jesus? Well, if we go over to Mark 14, verse 57 and 58, it says that there were false witnesses at Jesus' trial. And it says they stood up and bore false witness against Jesus, saying, "We heard him say, I will destroy this temple that's made with hands, and in 3 days I'll build another not made with hands." Now, notice Jesus never said that. That's a mischaracterization of what Jesus said. He didn't say anything about destroying a man-made temple and rebuilding, but not by human hands. But and also when Jesus is on the cross later in Mark 15:29, the passers-by are mocking him, deriding him, saying, "Aha, you were the one that said you would destroy this temple and rebuild it in 3 days. Save yourself and come down from the cross."
Yeah.
Right? Now, notice that Mark's gospel, and this also is in Matthew, neither Matthew nor Mark give us the pretext of what Jesus actually said. Right? The reader is left hanging. It's an unexplained allusion. And in the context of first century Judea, saying you're going to destroy the second temple is not something you make jokes about, right? It's like shouting bomb on a plane. It's not, you just don't make jokes about that, right? So the reader's just left hanging. Well, what did Jesus actually say? Did he say that? It doesn't seem to be something that manufactured out of whole cloth, but rather a garbled version of something Jesus likely said, especially in view of the 3 days reference often associated with Jesus' resurrection predictions. And then when we go over to John, we learn the pretext But John doesn't report the later misrepresentations of what Jesus said, and it's used as an accusation. So you've got this hand-in-glove fit, this undesigned coincidence that actually supports and corroborates the independence and veracity of this particular account. And furthermore, I've got further evidence supporting this as well, because notice the Jewish response that it's taken us 4 to 6 years to build this temple. Well, according to Josephus, when did Herod the Great begin renovation on the temple? Well, it was in the 18th year of his reign, which falls in 19 BC. Now, if we go over to Luke's account, Luke chapter 3 tells us about Jesus commencing of his public ministry, and it was and oh, by the way, so 46 years. So if Jesus began so Josephus tells us that the renovation of the temple under Herod the Great began in 19 BC. 46 years on from that lands you in 28 AD. So that would be the timestamp for when this statement was said and when this episode took place. Now, in Luke's account, in chapter 3, it says, in the 15th year of the reign of Tiberius Caesar. So this is when Jesus began his public ministry. This is the year he was baptized, in the 15th year of the reign of Tiberius Caesar. Now, when was the 15th year of the reign of Tiberius Caesar? Well, according to Suetonius, in his Life of the 12 Caesars, Tiberius, in order to ensure the smooth transition of power, he became co-emperor with Augustus in 12 AD, and Augustus himself died in 14 AD. And so that would make the 15th year of the reign of Tiberius 27 AD. Now, the events where Jesus cleanses the temple in John chapter 2, that's taking place the following Passover, the Passover after Jesus begins his public ministry, the Passover after Jesus' baptism, which lands you again in 28 AD. So there you have two independent metrics, but which we've actually confirmed the same date by completely independent ways, which actually is more likely, given that this is historical, than that it's fiction.
Wow.
Yeah, thank you, brother. Thank you. And I have some questions, Somali atheists asking all the time. Some questions I have here. And the one of them I said earlier, I don't know if you answer or not. It is basically, if there is God, where is he? Show me. I want to see him. I want to touch him. I want to feel it or talk to him. So that's one of them. And should I ask all three or just one by one?
One by one, I think is better.
Okay, that's the first one then.
Sure.
Okay.
So the problem of divine hiddenness is one of the most difficult questions to answer. The objection is usually characterized as why has God not made his existence more obvious than he has, right? Why does God not make himself more immediately obvious to people?
Yeah.
And why has God not given us stronger evidence? And I would argue that if God has indeed given us sufficient evidence, then it's very difficult to impugn his moral character that he hasn't given us even better evidence than what he has, if he's given us sufficient evidence. And I would say that he has given us sufficient reason to conclude rationally that Christianity is in fact true. Now, and if people want my more detailed discussion of this, I have an article on my website called, which is on the problem of divine hiddenness. So if you send me an email, I can send you the link to that article as well.
Yes, please.
But I sometimes I get asked, why does God require us to get PhDs in astrophysics and molecular biology and New Testament studies to discern his existence? Why can't he make it more obvious and more immediately apparent? And I would say that actually it's not that hard to discern the existence of God. It's only been made artificially hard by bad scholarship. And so even Richard Dawkins, for example, in The Blind Watchmaker, he says that Darwin made it possible to be an intellectually fulfilled atheist. And what he means by that is that prior to Darwin, it was very difficult with intellectual integrity to maintain an atheist position because biology just cried out design. And then Darwin came along and proposed that you could explain the appearance of design without recourse to a designing intelligence. And so it's not that it's difficult to see that God exists, it's that it's been made artificially hard by the bad scholarship that is Darwinian biology. And I think that that even without being able to explicitly articulate the arguments for design in nature, one can still have an implicit understanding that when you see these higher level objectives being accomplished by these irreducible complex systems, or when we look at developmental biology, we see this very finely choreographed sequence of cell divisions and downregulations of genes and so forth. When we look at metamorphosis, how a caterpillar transforms into a butterfly going through a chrysalis stage, we see these are designoid features of the world, even if we couldn't debate a Richard Dawkins or and so forth. And likewise, I think that many of these hallmarks of verisimilitude in the Gospels are things which we can infer implicitly, we can see implicitly, even if we couldn't do a debate with the Bart Ehrman and so forth. So that's kind of what I'd say on that.
Thank you so much. And the second, it is, there's God, why so many suffering in the world?
Yeah.
Why it's not helping and coming? Yeah.
Absolutely. So the problem of suffering is also a very challenging question to address, because there's not simply an intellectual aspect, but there's also an emotional component to that question. So what I'd say in that is that I would argue that the problem of evil is evidence that tends to disconfirm theism. So it is evidence for atheism. And if it was the only evidence on the table, I would be inclined towards atheism. However, it's not the only evidence on the table. And I think that oftentimes people have this mistaken view of evidence where, in order to rationally accept a proposition as true, all the evidence has to confirm your position. And I personally distrust people who say that all the evidence confirms their position. If someone says that all the evidence supports evolution and there's no evidence going against it, then I lose confidence in their objectivity with the data. Likewise, if someone says all the evidence supports Christianity and there's no evidence going against it, I lose confidence in their objectivity with the data, because that's where you're very vulnerable and susceptible to confirmation bias. So I think it's perfectly acceptable to say, yes, there is evidence that tends to disconfirm theism, because for any complex topic, in the absence of omniscience, in the absence of having all the information, there's going to be both evidence for and against the proposition in question. Now, in terms of the problem of evil, I think that it's very easy to overestimate the strength of that particular evidence in disconfirmation of theism. And one of the reasons for that is that there's a dependence or an epistemic dependence between different instances of evil that we observe, because people are often very impressed with the sheer number of cases that we have in the world of apparently gratuitous suffering and evil perpetrated by individuals. And so they think, well, look at all these examples. So therefore, we have a very, very strong cumulative case from all those different examples of suffering in the world that we observe. However, if we suppose that, let's take the first instance of evil that we discover in the world, and let's suppose that it has what's known as a Bayes factor of 100. That just simply means that it's 100 times more likely if atheism is true than if theism is true. So it's evidence that tends to confirm atheism. It doesn't follow that the second piece of evidence carries the same evidential weight, because if God has a morally sufficient reason, however unexpected, for permitting instance 1, he might have a similarly morally sufficient reason for permitting instance 2, and instance 3, and instance 4, and so forth. One morally sufficient explanation could explain a lot of instances of suffering, whereas by contrast with the case for theism, we have not just one, the evidence is not just extensive, but it's also varied in kind. We have multiple categories of data that point in the same direction. One other final point I'll make here is that there's also a problem of what my colleague, Dr. Timothy McGrew, calls evidential entanglement, which is to say that evil and suffering presuppose consciousness, right? You cannot have suffering and you cannot have evil without having conscious subjective experience. But conscious subjective experience is much more probable on theism than it is on atheism. And so evil is actually something which is highly unexpected, both on theism and on atheism, which are two mutually exhaustive possibilities. And therefore, I would argue that the problem of evil shouldn't really move us significantly in either direction.
Yeah. Thank you, brother. Thank you, brother. Guys, if you have a question, now is the time, question and answer. And I will ask my final question I have here. And the final question, it is, we always talk about our God is so good, loving, kind. So if he's so good and so kind, why he's sending some people to hell? Why he cannot take everyone and give them grace, even those believe or not believe, take them all to heaven?
Sure. So the reason why hell exists is because it's an expression of God's judgment, and we don't actually have a lot of information about hell in Scripture. I think that the images of fire is is probably metaphorical, but it's referring to some spiritual reality, which is a very grave predicament to go to hell. Don't get me wrong, but I think probably the images of I don't think people are literally burning in fire, because fire consumes, right, and destroys. And also there are contradictory images, like hell is utter darkness, and yet there's also fire in hell. So how does that work? Well, probably these are metaphors for some sort of spiritual reality. And hell is separation, spiritual separation from the presence of God, at least from the favorable presence of God. So it's not separation from God because God's wrath abides in hell, but it is separation from God's favorable presence. And the biblical message is that God is holy and He's just, and He must come against sin with perfect justice and righteousness. But because of His great love for us and His great mercy towards us, in the person of Christ, He's provided a way for us to be made right with God through faith in His Son. And Christ, Jesus, the second person of the triune Godhead, broke into human history 2,000 years ago, and He, on that cross, absorbed the full wrath of God and the full fury of God against sin upon His own body on the cross, such that when he cries out tetelestai, and in Greek, when He's on the cross, meaning it is accomplished or it is finished, it's as though He turns over the cup of divine fury that the Old Testament speaks about in Psalm 75 and other places, and not one drop falls out of that cup of divine fury, because He's consumed it right down to the very last drop. So we can receive salvation then by trusting in Christ. Now, why does God not give? Why is universalism false? Why doesn't God just appropriate that to all people? Well, I think that people, if people don't desire God, then God is not going to force Himself on them, right? If people don't desire to be in the presence of God and worship God, then God isn't going to force them into heaven. In fact, C.S. Lewis gave the metaphor of that hell is almost as though the doors of hell are locked from the inside, that people don't desire the presence of God, and so they would rather be separated from God, and God is going to respect that. So
yeah, thank you so much. That's, I think, another question.
Yeah, we have a question by Appy Frenzy, who says, are the Muslims correct in saying that Paul was teaching something opposite to the teaching of the disciple of Jesus?
No, they're not correct in saying that. It's commonly argued, for example, that Paul contradicts James on soteriology, is how we are saved, and so James seems to suggest that we are saved through not just faith but works as well, whereas Paul is very big on salvation by grace through faith. And so this common objection that James and Paul contradict one another. The problem is that if you read James more closely and you read Paul more closely, you see they're actually saying the same thing on that particular point, because James is saying in James chapter 2 that works are necessarily going to accompany true saving faith, and Paul, in various passages, 2 Corinthians 13, for example, and other places, Romans 6, is basically the same thing. So I don't think that is the case. Hopefully that answers your question.
Yeah, thank you. I think it's comment. This one is not exactly a question.
No, it's not a question.
Just some people just saying God will punish everyone for their sin. Yeah, I think, if I don't see other questions, guys. If you have question, now is the last two questions you can just give us. But but brother, it was so good today. Thank you so much coming and teaching us on our channel. We would love to have you back again, and hopefully our viewers, they can contact you as well, directly to your channel and as well. Somalis, we will send to you, especially the atheists and those who has questions, difficult questions, you will answer for them. It was amazing teaching.
It's been great time, to be honest, and we enjoyed it, and I believe our audience enjoyed it as well. It was so knowledgeable and benefitable for us all. So
thank you.
Being here with us.
Thank you so much. It's been great being here. And one last thing I'll say is that if anyone here viewing is struggling with intellectual doubts about Christianity, please go to my website. I have a form there. Just click on struggling with doubts ? And then it sends me an email and tells me about the doubts that you're struggling with, and I'll set up a private Zoom meeting to talk to you about your doubts in confidence. So if anyone's interested in that, please do take advantage of it.
Yeah.
Wow, that's so good. That's so good. That's so good. And it will be anyone, anyone who want to contact you.
Yeah, great.
Yeah, we can do that as well. We can. Please post here on your link in your website, and Somali Prophet or the moderators can do that. And Dr. Jonathan's even your channel, they can post here. So I think this is amazing, brother. If you have final thought, you can share with us. Otherwise, you can pray for us. Yeah, conclude with prayer, please, if you.
Sure, I'll go ahead and conclude with prayer. Lord God, we thank you for our study today of the evidence that overwhelmingly points to the reality of Christianity, and we pray that if there be any here viewing that are skeptical of Christianity, that that they may consider this evidence seriously and dig into it. It might be a springboard for further investigation and study for them. And we pray that if there be any Christians who are wrestling with intellectual doubts, that they might be assured that the evidence for Christianity is strong and robust, and that you've not left yourself without a witness, because you will one day judge the world by the man you've appointed, and have given assurance of this to all men by raising him from the dead. So we pray for a blessing upon the rest of our day or evening as we part, and pray for a blessing on all those that have tuned in and given up 2 hours of their day to listen to this broadcast. In your son's name we pray. Amen.
Amen. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Thank you all of you who came here. Yeah, you want to say something?
Yeah, God bless you, brother, Dr. Jonathan. It was so great to have you, and we loved it. May the Lord bless you and your family and your ministry. Thank you very much. And thank you all of you who watch this session. May the Lord bless you as well. Thank you.
Yes, and anyone who speaks Somali after this will be the Somali live stream. Please come to our other second channel, the Somali channel. Yes, guys. So thank you, brother.
God bless you all. Thank you.
God bless you all. Bye-bye.
Yeah, bye-bye.